Hi, Pastor Charlie here with New Hope Lutheran Church and Pastor Charlie's Toolbox. So, one of the decisions you have to make when you're working with wood is what am I going to use to cut my wood? I've got a piece set up here, and what do I use to cut it? You're going to probably say, well, use a saw. Well, it's true, I will use a saw, but the question is, what kind of saw? I mean, there are so many choices. So many choices. I mean, first of all, I have here my miter saw. Safety first. That's one way of doing it. And then, but there's more. I could use a jigsaw. This little thing here. It's a little slower than I might like. So I could use a reciprocating saw. Works a lot faster. And then, nothing else works. I can always use the old skill saw. But you know, those are just some of the choices. Those are the power choices, because I can use things that don't require electrical power too. I can use the old-fashioned hand saw. Like that. I could use what's called a coping saw, which has a very fine blade. Unfortunately, it's a little slow too. Or, if I want to go big, with a hand tool, I can always go for the old-fashioned crosscut saw, like they did in the old days. It works better with two people, actually. The question is, how do you choose out of all these and more saws, which is the best choice? Well, the way to figure that out is to ask yourself two questions. First of all, what kind of cutting do I want to do? And secondly, what's the handiest and fastest way to cut for the situation I have on my hands? I mean, if I want to cut curves or round corners, then I probably want the jigsaw or the coping saw, because they have really small blades that can, they're thin, and they can curve around, and you can actually make round cuts with these things. If I'm just making a straight cut, well, any of the other saws will work in that case. And sometimes, when we only need to cut just one piece, we may not want to bother having to run an extension cord and plug a saw in, so we just use a hand saw of some sort. What I want to point out here is that there is no one way to cut a piece of wood. There are all kinds of options available, so nobody should think there's only one way of doing it. Now, we might be more comfortable with a certain saw, or find that one saw is better for us for a certain project we're working on. The thought that there is no one way to do something, Well, that brings me to our lesson for today from Mark 1 here, verses 29 to 39. What we find there is that Jesus has had a busy day, healing and teaching people, crowds of people who just wouldn't let up until late in the evening. So, after just a bit of sleep, Jesus got up early and he went to a quiet place to pray. A bit later on, his disciples hunted him down because there were all kinds of people looking for him once again. And, well, Jesus just couldn't seem to get a break. I think it's important for us to take note that Jesus did take a break, and it's just as important to know how he spent his break. He prayed. Do you know how to pray? A lot of people have this crazy idea that there is only one way to pray, and if you don't know what that is, well, I guess you just aren't able to pray. But the reality is, anybody can pray. In fact, God would love to hear from you. Think of prayer like this. It's like having a conversation with someone who knows you really well. The options for how you do it, well, there's at least as many as there are options for how to saw a piece of wood, and maybe even more. You can pray anywhere and at any time. You can kneel, but you don't have to. Sitting or standing work just as well. You can fold your hands together, but that isn't totally necessary either. Prayer isn't simply about your posture. It's about focusing on God enough so that you are telling God something, and maybe even taking some quiet time to listen for an answer. It's about getting things off your mind, just as you would do with a trusted friend, but even better, really. The choices people make about where, when, and how to pray, they really depend on what makes sense for them. It's a little bit like choosing which saw to use when we cut a piece of wood. It can depend on the situation we're in. It can depend on how accurate we want the cut to be. It can depend on what we're trying to do with this piece of wood. The important thing is to cut the wood. What I want you to remember then is that prayer is important. And remember that God loves to hear from you in prayer, and that how you pray it's really up to you. What's most important is that you do pray and you keep connecting to God.